Hi, everyone. It's great to see such a big crowd. 69 people already on the Zoom call with us. I'm Juliette Berger. I'm president of your Washtenaw Audubon Society. I'm glad to see you all and see so many faces I recognize and see some new faces as well. I wanted to introduce Jessica Adamczyk. She's our secretary of Washtenaw Audubon Society Board, and she'll be helping us with all matters related to our Zoom. And Mike Sefton is here. He's our vice president and program chair. If you're interested in doing a program for Washtenaw Audubon, get in touch with Mike. Diana Miller is also here. She's our membership chair, and she would love to help you sign up for a membership. I noticed recently when I was looking at the website that there's a donate button and not a join button. But if you want to join, you click the donate button and then you can choose donate or join. We'll probably be fixing that in the near future. Some people have been a little confused by it. But we would welcome your membership. What else? Anybody else that I should be introducing? There's 4 screens of people. I don't know if anybody here, if any of the other board members are here, but it looks like we have a really big crowd. So awesome. Thank you all for coming. As is customary with all of our programs, I always read our diversity, equity, and inclusion statement because I want everyone to know what we're about and that everyone is welcome. The birds Washtenaw Audubon pledges to protect differ in color, size, behavior, geographical preference, and countless other ways. And as we honor and celebrate the equally remarkable diversity of the human species, Washtenaw Audubon Society considers the work of inclusion, diversity, and equity a top priority moving forward. We hope that in doing so, we can bring new creative energy and new creativity to our work in Washtenaw County and beyond for birds and people alike. Respect, inclusion, and opportunity for people of all backgrounds, lifestyles, and perspectives will attract the best ideas and harness the greatest passion to shape a healthier, more vibrant future for all of us who share our planet. We believe that protecting and conserving nature and the environment transcends political, cultural, and social boundaries. As an organization, we're committed to increasing the diversity of our board, volunteers, members, and supporters. And as an organization, Washtenaw Audubon Society strives to create a sense of community where all people can feel safe to explore nature and experience the wonder of birds. We respect the individuality of each member of our community and welcome all without discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, age, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, disability, national or ethnic origin, politics or veteran status, or any other status. All are welcome to bird with us and learn with us and to share our passion for birds and the environment. And with that in mind, we have some field trips coming up. Many field trips that'll be local. We still have a bit of the month of October left. Our Thursday morning group is meeting at the ARB still for the next couple Thursdays, tomorrow. And then next week will be our last one for the fall. Start up again in March of 2023. Matthew Spohr is our field trip chair, and he's got a lot of field trips lined up for us, including Saturday, we'll be going to the Hawk Watch at the Detroit River Hawk Watch at Lake Erie Metropark, and that's a follow-up to our program tonight that's being given by Josh Haas about identifying raptors on the wing. Michael will be doing the introductions, but first, I wanted to introduce Ben Lucking, who is one of our most celebrated birders. I keep wanting to say young birder, but he's not anymore. He's a full grown. He started out as a young birder in our organization, and now he's a world birder, fabulous world birder. Ben's going to be telling us about a field trip he'll be leading for Washtenaw Audubon in January, and I'm going to be going, and so is Diana Miller, our membership chair. And it's a small trip, but we're hoping to be able to include a few more of you. So take it away, Ben.
Thank you for the gracious introduction. So basically, I'll be taking 5 people, hopefully, to northern Ecuador, crossing both sides of the Andes between January 23rd and February 2nd, 2023. I will share my screen now with the little itinerary here. 1 second. So everyone can hopefully see this. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So yeah, basically January 23rd to February 3rd, sorry. And we will be looking for hopefully around 50 hummingbird species, Andean cock of the rock, plate-billed mountain toucan, as well as lots of rarer stuff as well, like greater scythebill and Peruvian antpitta, lots of cool stuff. It's a great introduction to South America. It's a very safe country, a very comfortable place to bird. The temperatures will be nice, a lot nicer than here in January for sure. And it will cost just a little under $1,800 per person for 12 days, including everything except flights. So yeah, I'll add links to all of the information in the chat, and I'll welcome any questions or anything. You can direct them to my email, which I'll also put in the chat. And yeah, with that, I won't take any more time away from Josh, but here we go. 1 second. I'll add these now, but thank you guys.
So it'll be really fun to have this trip be full. It's coming up soon, so we'll have to get on the stick and get plane reservations and trip insurance and whatnot. And please let Ben know as soon as possible if you're interested in joining us. Ben's going to be not only our organizer, but also our trip leader throughout the 12 days that we'll be in Ecuador. We'll be going to some lodges where we'll go on guided tours, but for the most part, Ben is our guide, and I can't wait. Ben's been to Ecuador a few times now and knows the birds. Yeah. We'll have another international trip going with Bryn Martin, Sunday, August 6th through Saturday, August 19th, and that one is to Northeast Argentina. The trip is limited to 7 people, and Bryn would like to have people be in contact with him if they're curious about details to the Northeast Argentina trip. And I will put Bryn's email address in the chat. And without further ado, unless there are any more amazing bird sightings, I will turn things over to Mike Sefton, who's going to introduce our speaker this evening, Josh Haas. We have 100 people on this Zoom, so suffice it to say, we have more folks than we probably would have had in our in-person event that had to be rescheduled for Zoom only this evening. Thanks a lot, Josh, for bringing your entourage. And Mike, please introduce Josh for the evening. Mike, you are muted.
There we go. We're happy to have Josh with us tonight. He'll get you all ready for that field trip Saturday to the Lake Erie Hawk Watch. Josh is a Michigan photographer and vice chair of the Hawk Migration Association of North America, Humana. He board of Humana. He's been birding and photographing serious over 17 years, and he has a passion for teaching others ID. So Josh, take it away, please.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike. Couple things. So $1,800 for a trip to Ecuador over 12 days. I can't tell you guys how much of a smoking deal that is.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Take advantage of that now because everything is going up seemingly. So, and second, I can't remember the dates of your Argentina trip or tour, but we're not going to feature the Swainson's hawk today because you're not going to see one in Detroit on Saturday. However, this is where these birds go. So if you go, this can be a fun homework assignment for you tonight. Go to your range maps in your field guide of choice and look up Swainson's hawk tonight. Do me a favor and wait to do that until after the program. But take a look at that range map. It's fascinating. It's one of my favorites. Just the trip that these birds make twice a year is astounding. So take a look at it. Mike, thanks again for that great intro. And I'm super thrilled to be here and just really want to extend my appreciation to your group and your leadership for allowing me to remain home tonight. A little bit under the weather, so I didn't want to take a chance and possibly infecting anybody. So thank you again, and really excited to be here. And I'll tell you, this is going to be the third time this week I'm giving a program like this on this topic. And I don't know if any of you saw it today at a Lunch and Learn for Humana, but I loved the program today, and I was the one giving it. So it can only go even better tonight. So I'm really looking forward to it. And I've got several species that we're going to go through tonight that I specifically picked out for your tour, your field trip rather, this coming Saturday. So what I just can't thank you enough for scheduling a program like this several days before you're going on this field trip. It doesn't matter that it's me, but to be able to target an ID program like this, what I would call just in time, to be trained right before you go is brilliant. So I always tell people, with Raptor ID, there's simply nothing better than going in the field, being with an expert, and actually experiencing it live in the flesh. So you're going to do that on Saturday. That's wonderful. We can't mimic that to a T in a classroom setting or program setting, but we can try and do the next best thing. And I really firmly believe that the next best thing is through video. There is just a plethora of books on ID out there. Anything by Pete Dunn, Brian Sullivan, Jerry Ligori, all of it's outstanding. But you know what? To me, there's nothing better than actually hearing how to identify these birds and seeing it on screen. Okay, the only thing better would be live, which some of you are going to do this Saturday. I hope you will join in that trip. So to get things started, I kind of want to walk through some precursory kind of things that will kind of set the stage for a mostly ID talk. So we're going to really dive into each of the species. We're going to see some video clips of all of them. I'm going to feature a few side-by-sides from the Hawks on the Wing movie and walk you through a lot of this stuff. I don't want to overwhelm you, so we're only going to do, maybe 11, 12 species at most. And the goal there is that we give you quality versus quantity. I don't want to overwhelm you and try and rush through all this stuff ahead of Saturday. So that's the goal tonight. And if you haven't heard of the Hawk Migration Association of North America, check out their website. It's Humana, HMANA.org. And more importantly, check out hawkcount.org and take a look at, on the left-hand side, find a hawk watch. And once you get to there, you'll have this great drop down, as you can see kind of midway up the screen. Go to the Detroit River Hawkwatch site and start studying what you could be seeing this weekend. So Hawk Count is just an amazing resource that is unlike anything I've seen in terms of migration data availability to the public. There's banding data that's out there, but it's hard to find for a lot of the families of birds. In terms of Raptor ID, this is it in North America. You can go out there, check out what sites you could possibly go visit when you're traveling. You can pre-plan your trip based on the type of species you're looking for. For example, if you're going to see broad-winged hawks, this Saturday is not your day, because I'm here to tell you they're already going through Veracruz, Mexico right now. So timing is everything. However, now is the time for great turkey vulture flights, red-tailed hawk and red-shouldered flights, and maybe an early rough-legged, but probably the birds you're going after are the golden eagles, and this is the prime time for golden eagles. So my sincere wish to all of you to see a golden eagle this Saturday. So anyway, back to Hawk Count. It's just a wonderful resource for you to plan your day, and you can kind of go back in time throughout the years, take a look at the weather forecast for this Saturday, and find days in roughly mid-October where there were similar weather conditions, and you can start to develop an idea of what you're going to experience. So not the most ideal weather conditions coming up this weekend. It's warming up. We don't like that. We like cold fronts with raptor migration in fall. But turkey vultures, some of these big bootios like red-tailed hawks, the eagles, they tend to fly in weather conditions that are subpar. In fact, the biggest red-tailed flights that Mackinac Straits sees every spring are on north winds in the spring. Seems opposite, but go out to Hawk Count data and look it up. It's unreal. These birds go. Now, it's not stiff headwinds, but they're going into headwinds and they're making the journey. So I think you're going to do okay this weekend. It's not going to be, substantial flights by any mean, but you're going to see some decent action. So moving on, let's kind of dive into what raptor identification is all about. And I always like to tell people, it's kind of a combination of art and science. It's not all science, it's not all art. But, what I always like to say is, there is a scientific approach to identifying these raptors, but there's also a feel to it. And that's where art comes in. So you have to kind of develop your own feel for what you're seeing. I'm going to tell you a lot of terms tonight, in terms of how I'm going to describe wing shape, whether the wing flap is stiff or maybe flexible or loose. Those are terms that you might understand in one form or shape or another, but applying it to seeing what you're seeing live on these birds might be a different story. So you have to kind of develop your own feel and your own sense for what you're seeing. And I'm going to share some things that I've learned from others, and I continue to learn. I was really moved by a recent post on Facebook by Ken Kaufman, because I've often paused at developing further field guides for things like raptors that I'm not as familiar with. But his recent post, really, he was sharing how much he learns from diving into writing a new book on some new subject that, you wouldn't expect someone to write, that maybe they don't know a whole lot about. But the amount that he's learning from writing these books is just part of that experience. And so I just was really taken by that. I thought it was a really wonderful thing that he shared. So point being, be willing to learn from those around you. Even if you think you've got it, don't have that attitude. Always have this mindset for continuous learning. So one trait is never enough. You're going to hear me say often tonight that we're putting pieces of a puzzle together. And when you put a puzzle together, jigsaw puzzle, and let's say it's 100 pieces, you don't need all 100 pieces to start to see the image that's coming through. Oftentimes with a 100-piece puzzle, you might only need 30 pieces to start to see that image kind of come out. And that's all I mean by one trait is not enough. When we're putting together the puzzle, I don't want you to think in terms of, I think that's a sharp-shinned hawk because I see a square tail. And that's what everybody tells me to look for, is this square tail. Well, any hawk watcher with a little bit of experience is going to tell you that not every Sharpie is going to come through having a square tail. And not every Cooper's hawk is going to come through having a round tail. So that one trait turns out to not be diagnostic. You can't just use that one trait. So you have to look at others in addition to the tail. What's the shape of the bird overall? What's its wing structure? How is it holding its wings? How is it flapping its wings? More importantly than some of those, how is it behaving? So many times people don't look at the behavior of the birds. They just look for these 2 or 3 other things that they feel is their comfort. And so really be paying attention to the behavior of these birds. On the far left, we see an American kestrel. In the middle, we see a merlin. These 2 birds in flight act and behave completely different. They also have behavioral traits that, oh, we're getting a little bit of an echo here. We need that iPhone 11 mute. There we go. All right. So be willing to look at the behavior, because in the sense of the merlin and the kestrel, their behaviors are totally different, both in flight and how they act and react to other birds in their space. So behavior is really important. So I mentioned, getting outside, spending time with the experts. I'm excited that you guys are going to take part in that this weekend. I think that's so huge. Certainly have to respect the counters time, but there are plenty of volunteers. Andrew Sturgis, for one, several people there that will be willing to help. So don't be afraid of that, but certainly be respectful of the counters doing their job. Have that continuous learning mindset, meaning don't think you're an expert. Always be willing to learn something new. And you know what? If you walk away having not been able to identify every single raptor that you see, that is 100% okay. Don't put unrealistic pressure on yourself, because you're going to walk away disappointed. So really set some realistic goals. Don't try to go ahead of the trip Saturday and study all 16, 17 raptors, because 1, you're not going to see that many based on the timing. And 2, you're just going to overwhelm yourself ahead of time, and then you're going to be under a huge amount of pressure on Saturday. So don't do that. Take a choice few that you think you're going to see a lot of, and study those ahead of time, and go with this attitude to just have fun. So when we talk about Raptor ID, it really does require a mindset that needs to shift. And what I mean by that is, if you think of like warblers in spring, or any kind of migrating bird like shorebirds or gulls, we're using typically field marks to identify those birds. So we're looking for color, we're looking for the beak shape, or the beak color, the leg or feet color, things like that. It's all field mark based for the most part. And we need to throw all that out the window. So we need to concentrate on things like shape, flight cadence, how they're flapping, and in the rare case that you get to see the plumage, then apply some of the field mark ID if you get that opportunity. But I'm here to tell you, especially in spring, when we have raptors that are moving north, coming from the south, think about where the sun is. You're going to be looking directly at the sun most of the time. So the bird that's fully silhouetted on the far right is what you're going to see. So in some cases, that's a good thing, because as you're learning, if you're looking straight into the sun and all you're seeing are silhouettes, that's forcing you to remove that field mark birding technique and focus on things like shape, flight cadence, and so on. So that's what we want to do. We're not always afforded that beautiful colored look of the peregrine that we see on the far left. Oftentimes, it's more towards the right side of the screen and what we're seeing in reality. So again, with that puzzle, we're just gathering a few pieces of the puzzle to gather enough data in order to definitively identify this bird as a red-tailed hawk. And I can see by the shape of the wing, as well as luckily for us, seeing those patagials on the front leading edge of the wing here, these dark bars, that we have a red-tailed hawk here. Now, understandably so, this is not a silhouetted bird. That's not the point of this. The point of this is that we just need a few pieces of the puzzle. Don't rely on one alone, but you also don't need all 20 pieces either. So let's go through the general raptor families that we're going to see migrating. We've got our accipiters. These are the forest-dwelling hawks. These are the hawks in your neighborhoods that you're going to see taking songbirds from your feeder stations. They're long tail, they're short winged, so that they're built and they've adapted for that adaptability, or that maneuverability rather, through tight spaces. Next, we have our falcons, as seen here by the peregrine. These are the birds that are made for speed. They're built for that speed. And we can see that in their long, slender wings that are often swept back to a point. They're all about speed. But again, like I said earlier, there's behavioral and flight cadence and shape differences in all 3 of these birds that we can look for and take away from the birds we're seeing live in order to definitively come up with your ID. Next, we have our bootios, as seen by the red-tailed on the screen. And this bird is going to be our foundational benchmark for our bootios tonight. We're going to go through a few different bootios, and the subsequent bootios that we go through after the red tail, we're going to compare to a lot of those features that we see on the red tail. And the reason for this is, when I teach people, when people ask me rather, hey, what advice would you give me for getting into birding and learning how to identify these birds? The first thing I always tell people is, listen, set a realistic goal in spring. Don't go out to McGee Marsh expecting to see and identify easily 20 warblers. That's completely unrealistic. Set a goal to see 3 or 4 based on the timing of migration that you could see, and study the heck out of those 3 or 4 birds and work on those 3 or 4 birds alone, in a way somewhat ignoring a lot of the other noise, if you will, in the other birds. Yeah, you're going to miss some of those other birds, but your concerted effort in being deliberate for those 3 or 4 birds is going to make you recall and remember those birds forever. And do that for a few years and you'll start to gain so much confidence. And so we're going to use the red tail in a similar manner, in that you probably all can instinctively identify things like northern cardinals and blue jays. Well, the reason for that is because you see them all the time. In the case of the red tail, that's part of why we're going to use it as a benchmark. We see them all the time. It's the raptor, the bootios that we see the most, so we're going to use it as our comparison tool. Next, we have our eagles, and tonight we're going to go through both bald eagle and golden eagle because you have a great chance of seeing both. This is the prime time for golden eagles. Certainly the weather's not the best, but hopefully you get 1 or 2 at a minimum this Saturday, and certainly my fingers are crossed for you because it's just a wonderful sight to see. And lastly, we have our ospreys and our harriers. Tonight we're not going to go through osprey. Certainly you could see one. It's getting a little late, and you have a better chance of seeing harriers, so that's why I went that route. And certainly for time's sake, I want to make sure we have some time at the end for questions. So to set up our ID charts here on the far left, you're going to see a range map for all of these birds. Again, your test, your homework for tonight is to go look up this range map for Swainson's hawk later and just enjoy what you see. On the right, you're going to see a single image of the bird. You'll see the soaring and gliding profiles, which are incredibly important. We're going to see those for every one of the birds. And then some quick flight tips that I share for each individual. Now let's refocus on the profiles. So I just kind of want to level set the difference between a soaring profile and a gliding profile. So a soaring profile, let's talk about soaring. Soaring is basically birds that are going in lazy circles, not a whole lot of flapping going on, but they're rising in altitude, okay? The classic flight of the broadwing hawk, okay? The red tails, the red shoulders, they'll do it as well. The eagles will do it. So you're going to see some soaring hopefully this weekend. Now, in terms of gliding we're gonna put in terms of active flight. So active flight, what I mean by that is you have a bird that's actively flapping and gliding and taking a line. They're going from point A to point B in more or less a straight line. Completely different than going in circles in one general area and rising in altitude. So those are the differences that I'm talking about. So when we talk about soaring profiles and gliding profiles, I hope that makes sense. So we're going to see that in all the videos of every bird tonight, and we're going to talk about that at length because it's an important aspect of determining that ID. So let's dive into our accipiters. We're going to start with our sharp-shinned hawk, or as you'll hear at the watch, people will say, hey, there's a Sharpie coming. You hear them called Sharpies. Look at the soaring profile. It's absolutely flat. So when they're soaring, going in those circles, you're looking for a flat-winged profile. Their wing beat is incredibly rapid. It's very snappy, and it's more from the wrist outward. So when I say the wrist, I'm talking about the middle part of the wing here, right here. So their wing flap is more from the wrist outward, meaning if my arms were wings, I'm flapping more or less with just my hands, not my whole arm. And it makes it a little bit flexible and more loose and not as stiff like our Cooper's hawk. Their head also appears extremely small relative to their bodies, and in active flight, they push those wrists forward, which creates this little nice pocket for the head to sit nicely within. It just makes it look like it was meant to be there. And because their head projection is so short, meaning the distance that they push their heads forward in front of their wings, it makes it look like their heads are quite small. So let's take a look at what this bird looks like in the video. So here we have a soaring bird. Notice real quick, when it comes back around, you'll see this pinch point where the tail comes and meets the body. It's very thin. It's a pinch point, as I call it. And it looks like there's nothing there in a way. It's lacking substance. The wings are very perpendicular to the body in a soar. And as it comes around, look for that flat winged profile right there. Now you get to see that rapid wing beat more from the wrists outward. It's very fluttery, very rapid. And it's a little loose, especially relative to the wing flap of the Cooper's hawk. There's that super rapid, just extremely fast wing beat. They're not very stable. They're really small and light. They almost take on some similarities to blue jays. Someone pointed that out in the program earlier today. That was right on. Here in active flight, we see this flapping and gliding, which is a very common thing in Sharpies. But look at that pocket that the head's sitting nicely within. So not much head projection. I think overhead, when these birds are flying overhead like this actively, when they glide, they look like little button mushrooms from the grocery store, just flying right overhead. You will see Sharpies this weekend, I assure you. So in contrast, let's take a deep dive into our Cooper's hawk. Notice right away the soaring profile. So now we have a soaring bird that we know is an accipiter. Right away, I want to look for that soaring profile. Is it flat-winged like the Sharpie, or is it slightly upturned in what we call a dihedral? Now that's a piece of the puzzle that tells me, ooh, I think I have a Cooper's hawk. What else can I see? How does it flap its wing? Well, remember the Sharpie was more fluttery, rapid, and loose from the wrist outward. The Cooper's hawk is stiffer, okay? So picture rigidity. It's stiffer wing beat, and it's using the entire wing. So if my arms are wings, I'm using the whole arm. Classic Cooper's wing beat. They tend to have this longer, thinner winged appearance, even though it's not really there. They take on that appearance, especially in a soar, because their wings are often held perpendicular to their body, and you see that very perpendicular leading edge of the wing as it's compared to its body. Look at the giant looking head. That's all because of that head projection. Their heads are projected way far in front of their bodies. And even in high winds, when they do thrust their wrists forward like a Sharpie, their head is still going to project way further in front of those wings. So let's take a look at what that looks like. All right, so notice the tail. There's no pinch point in this bird. Very long. It's elongated in the body and much more tubular. So as it's flapping and gliding, and soaring, we start to take on that slight dihedral, that upturned wing. Look also how stable this bird is. It's a larger, heavier bird, so it's going to be more stable as it's soaring. It's going to soar in larger, lazy circles, larger than that of the sharp-shinned. When it flaps its wing, take special note of how much stiffer it is. Understandably so, that takes some practice to get that down. Look for Cooper's hawks this weekend, but at Detroit, you're going to get far less Coops than Sharpies. I'll talk about that after the video. Again, that slight dihedral, that's what you're looking for. Now in active flight, you can still see that nice tubular nature of the body. The wing beat is slightly slower and again uses more of the wing. We can also see a slight drooped appearance of the glide profile when it's gliding. All right, excuse me. Okay, so seeing them side by side, we see that head projection first and foremost. At least that's what I see. So when we look at the Sharpie on the right, this is that little pocket that I'm talking about. So that's the pocket. Also, we see a smaller head. And over on the left, we see this huge head projection where it's far in front of the body. And these perpendicular wings, that it holds its perpendicular wings both in active flight when it's flapping and gliding, as well as when it's soaring. And what I mentioned, the winds, only in really high winds do we see Cooper's hawks throw their wrists forward and take on the shape of a Sharpie. So I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit about the difference in numbers between Coops and Sharpies. So if you think about it and you look up their range maps, you're going to notice that a Cooper's hawk is more of a southern breeder relative to the more northern reach of the Sharpie. So if you think about that in terms of where they're migrating, it kind of makes sense that we're going to see more Sharpies come through because they're more northerly in their breeding and they're coming through to their wintering grounds. Where we have coops here that are much more readily available in terms of breeding. And so the coops just are in far less supply. They're not moving as much. So it's only the most northern Cooper's hawks in their range that are the birds that are actually moving through. So you see a lot less. If you really want to challenge yourself with Coopers and Sharpies, go to a place on the coast like Cape May. Their numbers are much more evened out. So it's easy in the Midwest to call out a Sharpie because 9 times out of 10 or more, you're going to be right just based on those numbers. But at Cape May, that's not the case. Everything is evened out. So it forces you to really challenge yourself. So let's see these birds side by side.
The sharp-shinned versus Cooper's comparison represents one of the most difficult pairings, but there are clues that help distinguish the two. Notice the Cooper's hawk on the right has a longer, bulkier tail that also feels more round. Don't forget, however, the round versus square tail doesn't always hold true. Also notice the Sharpie on the left shows a smaller head that is tucked back closer to the body, where the Coop's head projects forward. While soaring, Sharpies will flap more often because they are less stable, where the Coop holds steady. Also look as the sharp-shinned hawk is making tighter circles. The bird is actually starting to get ahead of the Coop. Comparing the wing flap is easier when side by side. Notice the Cooper's hawk has a slightly slower wing beat, but more importantly, it's using more of the entire wing, whereas the Sharpie is quicker, snappier, and flaps more from the wrist outward. Check out this Sharpie displaying its tendency to flap more often, where the Coop is gliding longer between flaps.
All right, so into our falcons. So we'll start with the kestrel, and the first thing that I see when I see this image is elongated, thin wings. And they look like banana peels. So it looks like a body with 2 banana peels for wings. Very long, slender, pointed, banana-like wings. They're also very dainty and small and very nimble in flight. So with that buoyancy, they kind of rise and fall a lot in altitude. They'll go left and right and kind of go all over the place. They don't hold a line very often. Only in their most active, deliberate flight do they hold a line. So more often than not, you're not going to see that. So that's really important compared to our Merlin, which we'll go through next. Their wing beat is very light and fluttery, light like a butterfly. They're dainty overall and also have a pretty elongated tail. So let's take a look at what this looks like in flight. So here's our banana peels for wings. We're going to see it in just a second. Very elongated, stretched out, very thin winged. And we need to keep that thin winged nature in mind as we get into the next falcons. Very flat profile in a soar, and this is a soaring bird as it's kind of moving about, trying to soar. You don't see falcons soar very often, so it's kind of a rarity. It's using its tail quite often, very fanned for maneuverability, but you'll notice it's rising and lowering in altitude and moving kind of all over the space that it resides in. In active flight, we see a drooped wing shape similar to a Sharpie. And from a distance, especially as they're coming at you, kestrels and Sharpies can look very similar, like this position right here. But as it gets closer, we start to see a very thin-winged bird, which tells us it's a falcon and not an accipiter. Here we see that drooped wing. Active flight, it's rising and falling ever so slightly. It does show a purpose from point A to B, but we see a lot of movement and fluttery wing beat as it's doing so. So in contrast, look at the wing of this Merlin. So when I'm looking at this structure here, right as it leaves the body, it's a thicker, more stocky, substantial wing. And one of my mentors, some of you from the area may know, Jeff Schultz, always told me, I'd always stuck with me, Merlins are like kestrels on steroids. Just absolutely always loved that. It's just such a perfect way to describe a Merlin. In fact, I had one Sunday at a migration spot for sandhill cranes, And it's the first thing I look for when I kind of go through the process of who is this? Who am I seeing? I'm looking at the wing of the falcon, and if I see this thick, substantial wing, I'm starting to migrate, no pun intended, right towards a merlin. So they're like kestrels, but they're stockier, they're bigger, they're like the bodybuilding falcon. They're feisty, they're incredibly fearless. They go after things in flight, especially even in migration. Even things, birds as large as bald and golden eagles, they'll attack and go after because they just like their space and they don't want anyone in it. They're incredibly powerful with their wing beat and very rhythmic. A lot of the books that you'll read by the famous guys, like Pete Dunne and Jerry Ligori, describe the wing beat as being very piston-like. So if you're familiar with how a piston works in a common gas engine, let's say, it's going up and down rhythmically over and over and over and over. It never stops. It's its job, and it's going to do that job through and through. And that's a merlin to a T. It's going to go from point A to point B deliberately, very directly, with a very powerful, repetitive, constant wing beat. To put it in perspective, pretty much all of my merlin footage comes from Cape May, New Jersey, which is a famous place for fall falcon flights. And they're always looking for what they call the trifecta, meaning they want to see over 100 birds of each falcon species in a day. And I was lucky enough one day to experience that. Merlins all over the place. I mean, 150, 200 merlins in a day. What a day. And I probably left that place with 2 or 3 video clips of these birds soaring. You just don't see it. And so I was thankful to leave with that. So you're going to see some of that footage. But these birds, again, 9 times out of 10 are going to be going from point A to point B in active flight. Behavior. Outside of being fearless, they hunt and eat on the wing. They typically don't stop to eat. They'll just pull it right out of their talons and eat while they're flying. In addition to that, they migrate oftentimes really low altitude. So these birds are hugging the tree line and oftentimes pop up over the hawk deck just in time for us to see that they went through. And oftentimes at a hawkwatch site, if you hear a merlin called out, it's called out in the form of past tense. Oh, there went a merlin, because we typically don't see them till it's the last minute. So here's a soaring merlin. Very hard to find soaring merlins, and even in a soar, it's acting in active flight. Look at it. It's basically taking a break, flapping its wing, going from point A to point B. Now he's kind of turned around, coming back into a soar. Soaring on flat to slightly drooped wings. Again, this is the soaring profile. It's not going to be much different in a glide. Look at the wing. Compared to the kestrel, it's a lot stockier. It's not so symmetrical from leading edge to trailing edge either, front to back. It has a very perpendicular trailing edge to the wing and swept back on the leading edge. Again, pretty much the same in terms of glide profile, slightly drooped. And we're going to see these birds again go from point A to point B deliberately, mostly flapping the entire time. There's that nice piston-like wing beat over and over and over and over, very rhythmic, propelling these birds at incredible speeds even when they migrate. And lastly, for our falcons, we're going to look at our peregrines. Some of us are lucky enough, if you're in the Ann Arbor area or Detroit, Battle Creek, Kalamazoo, you can see peregrines in the downtown, the city environments. Seeing them in migration is a little different. And I like to, it's a little bit more exciting because look at the range map. Look at where these birds are coming from in the extreme northeast of North America. And in some cases, way up in the Arctic as we move west. So it just boggles my mind. Migration's amazing. We're seeing birds that are hundreds, if not thousands of miles away that just so happen to come through. It just boggles the mind. So in terms of those profiles, pretty close to each other. The soaring profile is pretty much dead on flat, and the glide profile is slightly drooped, similar to what we saw on the merlin and the kestrel. So these are just larger, lankier, stockier looking birds than the other two falcons, where the kestrel and merlin are pretty similar in size, although they differ in daintiness versus stockiness. The peregrine just always looks large and in charge. There's only some rare times where a large female merlin can look similar to a peregrine and maybe trip you up a little bit. But most of the time, the peregrines have such a slower wing beat. They tend to flap and glide more often. So, comparing them to a merlin is a little easier than some of the other pairings because of that difference in behavior and flight cadence. They also soar more than the other falcons, so it's not unheard of to see peregrines soaring, and they typically have their tail fanned quite a ways out when they're soaring. So let's take a look at what these guys look like. So some of the books will describe their wing shape, especially in a soar, as being symmetrical and very much like a candle flame. So we'll see that when I stop the footage here in a second. Very thin-winged, but stocky and larger overall. Kind of a in between a merlin and a kestrel if it was a lone bird way out and you didn't have any size to judge. Notice that fan tail in a soar, and pretty much dead-on flat soaring profiles, not drooped or upturned too much at all. Here's active flight. It's very whip-like in terms of that wing beat. It's slower than the other two falcons, but again, it looks like it's whipping the air. So whip, whip, whip. Here's another instance of an active bird. He's got some feathers out of place. He's likely about to lose a primary flight feather. But even with missing feathers, things like that, the way that they fly remains the same. So it's pretty cool. It doesn't matter if there's some things off. They're still going to flap their wings the same way.
Hey Josh,
On
this
to
is
our-
Jessica
oh.
jumping in here really quick. We
Yeah,
have a question
sure.
in the chat.
Okay.
Do merlins have sideburns like the peregrines and
Oh,
kestrels?
yeah, the mustache mark, sideburns, sure. They're there, but they're incredibly faint at best. So if you look at, there's a couple races or subspecies of merlin. You've got the western and the eastern. The western tend to be darker, and you don't notice any of that mustache mark usually. Sometimes, if you have an incredibly close bird, maybe perched, and you have a really good scope, you might be able to pick it out. But they look like they're lacking those contrasty mustache marks that you see in both the peregrine and the kestrel. So that's a great question. So moving into our bootios, we'll start with, again, that foundational benchmark that we're going to use. Look at the muscular nature of this bird. I love this. This trailing edge, this back edge of the wing is what I'm talking about here. And so, I heard it best from Bob Pettit several years ago. Some of you are familiar with Bob. Very important person to Holiday Beach and just the conservation world. So hats off to Bob. But anyway, Bob described the muscular nature of the red tail as being like a bodybuilder. If you see a bodybuilder holding their arm up, showing off their bicep, if they were to take that arm and turn it upside down, their bicep would be kind of hanging below. That's what we're talking about here with these secondaries that are hanging below on the trailing edge of the wing. So that stocky, huge, muscular look to the trailing edge of the wing, that's what we're talking about. The soaring profiles, it's a dihedral. It's a slight dihedral, meaning that upturned wing. And we're going to see that in the video. You see it in almost every soaring red tail. Regardless of you're out west, east, north, it doesn't matter. They all fly the same. They have a pretty rapid wing beat relative to their body size, but it's not going to be as rapid as, say, something like a broadwing or a red-shouldered hawk, which they take on more of an accipiter-like wing beat. Be careful of that red tail. Again, we're really pushing you away from field mark ID, and don't forget that the red tail doesn't come into view or into play on these birds until they're about a year old when they go through that molt. All right, here's our red tail. Look for that muscular wing shape. Something interesting to look for too when it comes around, when you see a really fanned tail in a soaring red tail, it almost looks like the fanned tail goes into the wings because those wings are so wide and so muscular as they meet the body. A lot of head projection. It's a very large, lanky bird. We can see that slight upturned dihedral, that upturned wing. These birds are incredibly stable in the sky compared to all the other bootios. So they're going to be heavy, lanky, and just command their presence when they're soaring. If they're in some sort of wind kind of hits them, oftentimes they just have to shrug their shoulders or maybe give it a flap to get back on course, where the other bootios have to flap a few times, they get buffeted, maybe go sideways before they get back on course. You'll rarely see that in a red tail unless it's like super fast winds. Here in active flight, we can see, again, a very stable bird, pretty rapid wing beat for the size of the bird it is, but it's powerful and rhythmic, but at the same time, it's shallow, meaning the wing doesn't go way up high above the body and it doesn't go way low below the body. So that we would describe that wing beat as being pretty shallow. So red shoulders tend to be smaller than red tails, but again, you have a lone bird, which oftentimes, especially Detroit, you might have a single red shouldered in the sky. So you can't judge size of a single lone bird. So don't try. It's a very pretty much impossible thing to do. You have to see something with it to judge size. And so it's very quick. I mentioned earlier, kind of an accipiter-like wing beat. So a lot more rapid than our red tail, but they're also longer tailed. So oftentimes these birds can look more accipiter-like overall at a distance. And Pete Dunn said it best in Hawks at a Distance when he said, if at first you see at a distance a red-shouldered hawk, or excuse me, a buteo, that turns into an accipiter once it gets closer, it is always a red-shouldered hawk. So something to kind of either read about or take with you. I always like to tell people in a soar, these birds project their wings forward, especially out to the tips, to where when they soar perpendicular to you, it almost looks like the shape of the letter C. So we'll see that in the video. Certainly we can see the crescents, and they're basically translucent outer primary feathers in the shape of these thin crescents that we can see in these birds, both as juveniles and adults. But that's something that typically you're not going to see until they're a lot closer. And just as a word of warning, you can see translucent primary feathers on all species or all buteos. And but the difference is the shape. So again, we mentioned thin crescent shapes on the red-shouldered, but in juvenile buteos like red-tailed, you're going to see blocky, translucent windows on those birds as well. They're just blocky and larger. So look for that this weekend because you'll likely see juvenile red-tails. So here's our red-shouldered in flight. Again, they don't look as muscular. They have more of a petite presence compared to the red-tailed hawk, and they have more of that accipiter-like wing beat. Flat to slightly upturned dihedral, and there's that thrusting wings projecting forward, kind of giving that shape of a C. It's a snappier, stiff wing beat. Again, kind of accipiter-like, so you kind of takes on that more fluttery, rapid look. And look at the long tail on that bird. So for a buteo, it's a pretty long tail, especially when you look at the wing shape. It's not as muscular as a red tail, but it's not as long-winged as something like a rough-legged. They tend to be energetic, and they're, again, not as stable in the sky. Look at this glide profile. It's so pronounced and drooped. You can see this from just a mile away when the bird's coming right at you. It's so much more pronounced than a red tail. Here we get to see it again. Now it's coming into view and starting to droop that wing pretty heavily. So I mentioned the rough-legged. One of my ever favorite birds. Look at the range map of this bird. I mean, so many people retire to Florida in warm climates. Literally, Michigan is their Florida. I mean, that's amazing. It's like Juliet was talking about juncos. They come here for their winter. Pretty amazing. Look at the soaring profile for these birds. They're not as muscular at all. Their wings are elongated and more plank-like, meaning they're more rectangular. They're not as shapely. Again, that soaring profile, just check out how steep that dihedral is, just a classic rough-legged. And here we see a new type of dihedral or profile in the glide profile. And we call this a modified dihedral, where the wing leaves the body in a rise and then levels off from wrist to tip. So really peculiar. You'll see this in harriers and Swainson's hawks as well. So the thin wing and incredibly slow wing beat relative to that of the red-tailed hawk. It feels labored and just much, much slower. They're incredibly confident in the air, though, and these birds at Whitefish Point, especially the adults, even in subpar weather conditions and winds, they'll make the journey across that 17 and a half, 18 miles of water, which is pretty astounding. I mean, that's a ways. And it's only because of the ridge line that you see on the other side of Whitefish Point that it gives this impression that it's not that far. But 18 miles is a pretty hefty distance for these birds to fly. And that's a lot of risk that they're taking. So often at Whitefish, you'll see birds start to make that journey, and within a half mile, they're turning around and coming back. Adult rough-legged hawks, they show their confidence. They just go and they don't stop. Let's take a look at what these guys look like in the video. Look at that longer wing. It's not as shapely, so it's more rectangular or plank-like, even though it still retains that bootio look. Dihedral, it's kind of teetering in the air, but very confident as it soars. These guys, similar to red-shouldereds, also thrust their wings forward in a soar, taking on that shallow C, letter C shape. They're incredibly buoyant. They're really lightweight. So if you were to see these standing side by side perched next to a red-tailed, they look roughly the same size, but they're all feather. They're so much lighter because of their Arctic breeding grounds. A very slow wing flap. It's deep. It goes way below their body. It's rhythmic and it keeps a beat. There's that modified dihedral where the wing leaves the body in a rise and then flattens out from wrist to tip. Just a stellar bird. Whitefish Point, 3rd and 4th week of April. It's heaven if you want to go see rough-legged hawks. It's the time to go. All right, we'll go through our eagles next. We're doing pretty well. And Jessica, thanks for jumping in with those questions. You're welcome to continue doing so. All right, so our bald eagle has a dead flat soaring profile, absolutely flat. Where in a glide, it takes on a slight bow shape. Very similar to the bow shape of an osprey, only much less pronounced. So it's that same bow shape, but a lot less pronounced. They have an incredibly large head relative to their body and tail. So this is a very key point that we want to keep with us when we're comparing bald and golden eagles, because golden eagles have a much smaller looking head. Part of what gives the bald eagle such a large head appearance is that massive bill that they've adapted to ripping and tearing flesh from fish. So part of that is helping with the look of that large head. They have incredibly slow and powerful wing beats. And you see here, I mentioned this deep upstroke. What I mean by that is when the wing flap, when it's flapping its wings and the wing is going up above the body, it goes a lot higher in that upstroke where it's going above the body than it does below. So the wing doesn't flap as far below the body as it does above. And you can see that with a little practice. You start to kind of dial in and look for that. You'll notice it. Let's take a look. Here we see a soaring bird. Notice a couple things for me. Very large pronounced head. It's projecting way far forward. Very perpendicular wings that are plank-like. They're not shapely like a bootio. It looks like a 2x8 plank of wood with a head and tail. Look at the length of that head. In relation to its tail, it almost looks like it's the same length as the tail. It's just absolutely massive. You're not going to see that in a golden eagle. So those few things right there are hugely important for identifying bald eagles. Ignore that white head and tail, because remember, you're not always going to see that. Look at the deeper upstroke. The wing goes higher above the body than it goes below. And these birds, when they're actively flapping and they stop flapping, they stop on a downbeat, as seen right there. And now this bird is going into that bow-shaped glide profile. We're going to see it in this bird here in just a second. So it's flat overall, but each wing takes on a slight bowed shape, which we can see just there. So flat overall, but each wing has that slight bowed shape. So here we have our golden eagle, and right away we can see a smaller head. Some of that, again, is due to that beak. They've adapted to hunt and eat differently. Their soaring profile, remember the bald eagle was dead flat. This bird shows a slight upturn dihedral. So much like we were looking for that between the Sharpie and the coop, we're going to do the same thing when we're seeing a soaring eagle. We're going to look for that between the bald and golden eagle. We see just a slight modified dihedral when they're in active flight and gliding. Much like the bald eagle, they have a very slow, powerful wing beat. But the difference here is the amount of flexibility versus stiffness. The bald eagle has a very stiff wing beat. The golden eagle has a very flexible or loose wing beat. So it's kind of like this instead of like this. So look for that when we show the video. The wing shape is also less Booteo-like. It's less shape, it's more Booteo-like, excuse me, and more shapely than that of the bald eagle. Remember, the bald eagle is rectangular, more plank-like. The golden eagle has more shape and broadness to it, and it looks more like a Booteo than it does an eagle. All right, here's our golden eagle. Look at that slight dihedral as it's soaring. Looks like a longer tail compared to that head, so the head projection it's just not there. Here's that slight dihedral we're saying, very similar to that of a Cooper's hawk or a red-tailed hawk, something like that. Remember, it's not modified in a soar. There's that lacking head projection, makes the tails look longer. Very lazy soaring bird, no different than the bald eagle, but what we want to look for is the wing flap, and we're going to see it here in a second. And we're looking for a more flexible, loose wing beat, not as stiff. So you'll see the kind of the tips flailing a little bit more than what we see in a bald eagle. There we see that. It's more flexible. These birds also, in contrast, they end their flapping on an upstroke, which we'll see right here. And they settle into that modified dihedral when they're in active flight. Again, that loose, more flexible wing beat. So here's a little bit more on that head projection that I was talking about. So a lot of the books that you'll read will talk about comparing the length of the head to the length of the tail. And they will go on to say that the length of the head on a golden eagle related to its tail length, the head is half or shorter than the length of its tail. Where in the bald eagle, the head length is the same as, is at least as big as half the tail, or in some cases even as long as the tail, depending on the angle that you see the bird. So suffice to say, it's all about head projection. In a bald eagle, the heads look much larger. In a golden eagle, they're much smaller. So let's take a look at these birds side by side.
Bald and golden eagles are both large and prominent in the sky, but some key differences are easy to pick out once you know what to look for. Even though the bald eagle on the left is closer, it shows thick, rectangular planked wings. It looks like a 2x8 plank of wood with a head and a tail. Speaking of heads, make sure to key in on the size of the head compared to the length of the tail. The bald eagle's head can appear as long as its tail, where the golden's head appears to be half the length of its tail or smaller. The golden on the right appears more Booteo-like with more muscular wings. Notice too, the bald eagle is soaring with flat wings. In comparison, the golden eagle has a slight upturned dihedral. The wing beat of the bald eagle is slow and stiff, but look at that deep upstroke. Golden eagles have slow wing beats as well, but they're uniformly shallow. Check out how the bald eagle ends on a downstroke when flapping. In comparison, the golden eagle ends on an upstroke before settling into its glide.
All right. So next we have our harrier, one of our specialists of the night. Look at the soaring profile, probably one of the deepest around. Only one similar to that's going to be your turkey vulture, which we're not going to show tonight. I know we're going to see a lot of turkey vultures this weekend, and you're probably used to them. So that was kind of why I made that decision to leave them out. But that soaring profile of the harrier is very pronounced, very deep. And this is another bird that we would consider very plank-like, meaning the wings are very rectangular. So where I said the bald eagle looks like a 2x8 plank of lumber with a head and tail, the harrier looks like a 2x4 plank of wood with a head and tail. So very elongated, stretched wing, but again, very rectangular. This bird also takes on a modified dihedral in a glide. So that wing rises from the body, but then flattens out from wrist to tip. A very slow but steady wing beat. And Eric Brunke, one of the recent counters at Cape May, New Jersey, described the wing beat very well in that it looks like it's bouncing basketballs on the ends of its wings. It's just a really cool way to describe it. So let's see what they look like in flight. So here's our Harrier, very long-winged raptor, also a very long-tailed raptor. We're going to try and ignore that white rump right now and just really focus on the shape and demeanor. Look at how it's teetering and kind of unstable in flight, very similar to turkey vultures. In fact, at a distance, they can look very turkey vulture-like. So I stopped the footage there a second ago, and you could see that very rectangular wing shape. Here we can also see the modified dihedral, very rough-legged like in that position. And now he's bouncing basketballs on the ends of its wings as he's flapping. Again, that teetering action and the modified dihedral that we're looking for. Very long wing, but that slow kind of whip-like wing beat is everything for the Harrier. Bouncing basketballs. I'm picturing a kid in a high school court just bouncing a basketball. Beautiful bird. That shape right there with its wings, its wrists thrust forward, very Swainson's hawk looking. You're not going to see that this weekend. They're more of a mid-September bird when the broad wings are coming through. And we're lucky to see one, maybe two a season at best. You really have to go west of the Mississippi to see a Swainson's, or a lot of them. So we do have time, so I will feature the osprey tonight. So osprey is another specialist bird compared, relative to the other birds that we went through tonight. But in every facet of flight, these birds take on a bowed wing shape. So it's also a heavy bow, a heavy droop on each wing. They're very gull-like. So in Detroit, these birds can present you with a problem in that there's lots of gulls around. And so if at first you think you have what is a gull that ultimately turns into a raptor, it's always an osprey. They're very gull looking in their plumage, so that certainly helps with that. But as they fly and as you get a better look at their wing shape, you tell something's off from that. It's not as pointed, it's not as slender winged as something like a gull. Their wing beat is incredibly stiff. I mean, the stiffest around, and it almost looks like the bird's in pain. Some of the books describe their wing flap as if it's arthritic and it doesn't want to flap its wings. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Like I said, very gull-like instead of a raptor. The wings are held in somewhat of an M shape, a very shallow letter M. As it comes around, I think I'll stop the footage and you'll see that. In every facet of flight, you're going to see that crooked wing shape that takes on the shape of a letter M. Their tips of their wings are also slotted, kind of like turkey vultures, so it looks like they're showing fingers at the tips of their wings. As the bird comes around, look for that bow-shaped wing as well. Again, in every facet of flight, they're going to show a slightly bowed or a stiff bowed nature or shape to their wing. They're pretty at home in the sky. They're very good and very buoyant at soaring. Here's a bird being very buffeted by winds going up and down, but it just looks like it doesn't want to flap its wings. It just looks like it's in pain when it's flapping its wings. We still see that crooked wing shape, the shallow M, and then there's that heavy droop to the wing when you're looking head on. There it is right there again. Awesome birds. So Jessica, what I've done here is I'm showing you every side-by-side I have available. And if people want to go into the chat and type in a side-by-side, a pairing of birds that they'd like to see, I can click on them and show them. And we can also take some time for questions, or people can start thinking of questions they would like to ask for after we play some of these side-by-sides. So I think we have time for at least a few of them. So if anyone could call out some birds, either using their mic or through the chat, we'll go there. It looks like we've got roughleg and northern harrier.
Yep, and then after that, there's one that went direct to me. It's a Cooper's versus red shoulder.
Okay. I don't know if I have that, actually. Yeah, I don't have that one. We'll talk about that in a second.
Both of these hawks have long wings, but there are some key clues that will solve the mystery every time. Both birds are buoyant, especially when soaring, but notice the rough-legged hawk on the left is flapping intermittently, where the northern harrier on the right avoids flapping. Check out the shape of the harrier's wings. They are even throughout and look like 2x4 planks of wood in a soar, where the rough-legged has broader wings that retain the boodio appearance. The harrier will also have a steeper dihedral and hold its wings mostly perpendicular to its body, where the rough-legged has a less severe dihedral and its wings are pushed forward. In active flight, the shape of the birds is definitely something to key in on. Both birds typically glide with modified dihedrals. However, the northern harrier will gently rise from the wrist to the tip, where the rough-legged is flat from the wrist to the tip. The harrier's wing flap is more from the wrists out, and it looks like the bird is bouncing basketballs with its wings. Rough-leggeds make flapping look easy with stiff yet powerful wing beats.
Yeah, so I don't have Cooper's and a red-shouldered, and the reason for that is the size difference between a red-shouldered and a coop is great enough that it just didn't make the cut. So what I do have, though, is goshawk and red-shouldered, and these two are so similar in size that they are an important pairing. We can certainly play it if folks are interested, but it is pretty early for a goshawk. Not unheard of, but certainly early for a goshawk.
I'd like to see it.
Let's do it.
Northern goshawks and red-shouldered hawks are one of the harder comparisons, but rest assured it can be done. In a soar, check out the red-shouldered hawk on the right and how far in front its wings are pushed forward, a typical soaring position for this boodio. In comparison, the goshawk on the left holds its wings at right angles to its body. Also notice the red-shouldered has a slight upturn or dihedral, where the goshawk is flat-winged in a soar. The goshawk has a smooth, powerful, deep wing beat, and the tail is stockier, almost like an extension of the body. Notice the red-shouldered has a snappier, stiff wing beat, making the bird appear more accipiter-like. They also tend to be more energetic in flight as they rise, fall, and flap more often.
How about one more?
One of our participants wants to see more golden eagle. So what can we compare golden eagle to?
Turkey vulture and golden eagle.
Vulture? That sounds
Yeah,
good.
you're going to see a fair amount of turkey vultures, I imagine,
Let's
Saturday.
do
So
that.
that's a good one.
When comparing golden eagles to turkey vultures, there are a few things to look for that will shed some light. When soaring, their profiles are slightly different. The golden on the left looks more boodio-like, with curved wings, where the vulture on the right is rectangular or plank-like. Notice how active the golden eagle is as it flaps more often. The vulture rarely flaps at all and is far less stable in flight. Both birds hold their wings in a dihedral, but the turkey vulture's dihedral is more pronounced. Again, notice the golden eagle is far more active as it flaps more often. The turkey vulture does everything it can to avoid flapping and is tippy or wobbly in flight. It also holds its wings in a modified dihedral when gliding, where the golden retains the same gently sweeping dihedral.
All right. So maybe we could take some time for some questions. I imagine, Jessica, there may have been some in the chat.
Yeah, we had a couple.
Okay.
Firstly, would you like to plug any books or CDs or video recordings you have and where folks can find them? A few people are asking for how to get more of your content.
Yes, so there's a few things that you can do, all of which you can find at hawksonthewing.com, which I'm putting in the chat right now. And so there's a few things out there. If you go to my blog, one of the first things out there is basically a complete video recording of a Zoom session from, I think, last year for Mackinac Straits of a very similar program with a lot of the ID content, some of the side-by-sides, and so on and so forth. So that's a free way to get some of that. I know Jessica and company are going to post this recording on the Washtenaw Audubon's YouTube site, so that'll be forthcoming. I'll probably give them a few days to get that out there. You can also find some past ID recordings on the Humana.org website. But if you go to hawksonthewing.com, aside from the blog, you can actually purchase the movie that has every one of the side-by-sides that you see here, as well as each individual species with voiceover, everything on top of every video that you want, basically east of the Mississippi. In addition to that, the movie also comes with a video that's birds that look like raptors. So things like pigeons, crows, gulls, things of that nature, ravens. And that's a really cool study because there are a lot of birds that can fool you into thinking you've got a raptor. So that's a good one. I also offer it as a digital download that you can download immediately and to your computer. It's a zip file. You unzip it, and then you have access to all the individual video files. It's not as intuitive experience as the DVD or the Blu-ray. Those act as more like an app, and that you can click through and click the ones that you want to see very easily. I also offer a laminated pocket guide that's really great for taking on site. And those that download the digital download, if you go through a few extra steps, you can actually move those video files over to an iPad or a similar mobile device and actually have the videos with you on the fly. So that's all found at hawksonthewing.com. And let's see, today's Wednesday. I'll ship tomorrow. I don't know if it'll get there in time, but you can try. So thanks, Jessica.
Of course, there was another question asking about what kind of gear is used at hawk watches. Is it typically binoculars, scopes? What do you find?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So binoculars first and foremost. I will tell you that there's pros and cons to Detroit River. A lot of people see this as a con, but the birds are far out. They're out there a ways. Only in certain winds do they really come right overhead at Detroit. So oftentimes the turkey vulture flights happen right overhead. So hopefully that'll happen. And you'll have other things mixed in. But you're going to want 8x42 or 10x42 binoculars. I use 10s because I'd spent so much time viewing things at a distance, and I've really gotten used to the shakiness. The more power you have, they tend to shake and you don't get as clear a picture. So if you're not a real steady person with binoculars, you don't want 10s, you want an 8 power binocular. And if you have a scope, it's a wonderful tool because you can find birds with your binoculars and they might be so far out that you're really struggling. If you can get on them with a scope that's maybe 20 or 30 power, what a great tool. You can get a much nicer look at those birds. I wouldn't go out and spend a fortune and buy a scope right now, but hopefully there'll be a few that can be shared on Saturday, and if you have access to one, it's certainly worthwhile.
Thank you, Josh. I absolutely want to encourage anyone to unmute themselves and ask questions, but going back up through the chat, I see there's a question from when you were showing the peregrine falcon and their range maps. Do the peregrines that summer in South America migrate in the winter? And if yes, where do they go?
That's an interesting question. Let's look at their range map.
While you're looking at the range map, I want to mention that Josh's presentation on Raptors on the Wing for us a year and a half ago is posted on our YouTube channel. And Jessica, maybe you can help me get the YouTube channel link into the chat.
Sure, give me a moment. I'll try to find it.
I got it on my phone, but I can't put it in there.
So the question was, does the South American breeding peregrines, do they migrate? Did I have that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
I do not know. That's a fascinating question. The fact that it shows, if this is up to date, the fact that it shows summer and not year round tells me that they do. Because if you look at the Western peregrines in the US, those birds don't migrate. They're there all the time. So, like I said, I don't know, but that would be my guess based on looking at the map. I can see a recent question in the chat. When counting, do you try to track adult versus immature? That's a really cool question. You know, every count site has what's called a count protocol. And part of that count protocol, in some cases, does tell the counter what they're required to do in terms of exactly what you're asking. Not only maturity, but in some cases, sex as well. You know, a lot of these raptors, they're not sexually dimorphic, meaning, you know, a female red-tailed is going to look identical essentially to a male. So you're not going to be able to tell on the wing whether or not you have a female or a male. But most of you probably know, like, kestrels are vastly different in sex coloration. And so you can track that. That often goes as just notes. It's not necessarily something of a trackable data element. But maturity is definitely something that's tracked in a lot of the Budios and the Eagles. So you've got about a 4 to 5 year cycle for bald eagles. And so typically, you know, where you can, a counter is typically going to identify whether they have a first, second, third, or fourth year bald eagle. And they'll do the same thing with golden eagles in terms of juvenile, subadult, and a full adult. Speaking of that, what's interesting, so we're more on the earlier side of probably early to mid golden eagle migration in fall, at least in our latitude. So you're going to see more juvenile and subadult birds coming through. As the season goes on, you're going to see more adults later. And in spring, the adults come through first. So Mackinac Straits is just an outstanding place for golden eagles. Go super, super early if you're willing to deal with the winter weather, and you're going to see full adult golden eagles coming through. So great question from Crystal Stratton.
There was a question earlier on about some birds where you can see the white rump, and you mentioned the harrier, but this listener was talking about possibly a Cooper's hawk in her neighborhood. She could see what looked like a white rump. Was that a Cooper's or a Sharpie? Maybe you could talk about that.
Oh, heck yeah. I love that. That's such a great, first off, a great thing that you notice. That tells me that you have some detail, attention to detail. And I would suspect that it's a female. And I say that with the most utmost respect. I was one of my jobs early on in my career, I was a software tester, and I learned that women tend to have more attention to detail. And that was as a result of me asking, why are there so many women, female testers in our office? And I asked that of a trainer once, and that was his answer, and that it's very normal, a normal thing. Anyway, I kind of digressed there. Cooper's hawks will often show what looks like a white rump, especially if there's any winds. And what's happening is their undertail covert feathers, the real soft kind of buffy feathers, are kind of getting blown around, and they kind of fold up and over their tail to make it look like they have a white rump. Juvenile red-tailed hawks will look like they have a white rump as well. Not as substantial as, say, the northern harrier. But back to the Cooper's hawks, in their breeding time, they do these breeding flights where it looks like they have white pantaloons, these kind of tubular white fluffs of feathers on either side of the tail. And that's a breeding thing. So depending on the time of year that you saw that, you might have been seeing that as well. But even if it wasn't breeding, Cooper's hawks, they're classic for showing a white rump, especially if there's some wind. A really good question.
So I looked up peregrine falcon in Birds of the World, and it says the southern hemisphere populations are largely non-migratory.
Interesting. And this is an old range map. I wonder if the newer range map might show that differently. It might be interesting to look in some more recent books.
Mhm.
Yeah. Any other questions?
The gal who asked the Cooper's hawk white rump question stated, yes, she's a female. There you go.
There you go.
There you go.
That's funny.
Terrence Skelton.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you,
Terrence,
Terrence.
you've been on some of my other programs. I recognize that. Great.
What else? There was another question way up.
This is Jessica. I think we caught all the questions, but again, if anyone else on the Zoom has a question, feel free to jump in.
There's that web address for anyone that is interested.
There's the question, what is your most memorable hawk watch sighting or experience? That's from Crystal Stratton.
Yeah, hard to narrow it down to one. My time at Cape May when I was there specifically for falcon footage, for Hawks on the Wing. And I purposely drove there and didn't schedule a flight because the timing of raptor migration is so weather dependent. There's just no way to schedule a flight without being there for, 2 weeks to really guarantee you're going to see the flight that you need. And so for the level of investment that I knew I was going to have into that trip, I decided to just drive and bear it. Well, anyway, there was a kind of a, not a real powerful, but a hurricane that was kind of going up the coast right around the time that there should be good falcon flights at Cape May. And I drove through just 100% rain and wind all the way to get there so that I was timed for when the meteorologists were expecting this hurricane to go out, to push out to sea. And so I got there the night before. It was supposed to happen sometime the morning or midday the next day. And exactly, how often do you hear this? Exactly what the meteorologists said would happen happened. This storm pushed out to sea, and in that probably 4.5 hour period, we had 170 merlins, over 200 kestrels, and well over 100 peregrines fly through. That was a memorable experience. But even more so, the next morning, we had peregrines at altitude when the sun was setting, still flying south, clearly making the trek over Delaware Bay. I think it's called Delaware Bay, the body of water between New Jersey and Delaware. And when you have a late flight like that, oftentimes that can signal that the next morning you might have a very early flight. And in some of the more detailed books on raptors, you will read that Cooper's hawks tend to hunt early in the morning, and Sharpies like to get on the move in the morning. And so the counter and I showed up right at sunup the next morning expecting a peregrine flight. We didn't get that. But what we did get was the most substantial sharp-shinned hawk flight I've ever experienced. I'm talking over 4,000 birds in like 2.5 hours, all in the morning. And it was a single flight line from point A to B. It was the easiest counting I've ever had in my life. I mean, you just had to sit there and click. They were all in the same flight line. I mean, 4,000 birds in just a couple hours. It was maddening. It was just so much fun. So that trip and those couple of experiences come to mind for me. But a lot of my other really memorable times are always the third and fourth weekend at Whitefish Point. Dark morph rough-leggeds, dark morph red-tailed hawks all over the place. Not parasitic, leucistic red-tailed hawks, leucistic rough-legged hawks I've seen at Whitefish Point. Weird stuff shows up all the time. It's just a magical place to bird. Thank you for asking that. It's fun to relive that stuff.
Crystal also asks what hawk watch sites are the best for the spring.
Assuming you're in Michigan, I would say Whitefish Point and Mackinac Straits are some of my favorites. At the beginning, someone was talking about a flycatcher they went to see at Port Austin, which also happens to be a fantastic place in spring for raptor migration and red-shouldered hawk flights. Really great red-shouldered hawk flights in the spring at Port Austin. Port Crescent State Park is the main count site, but then there's a little road a few miles to the east, depending on the winds, where they'll count as well. That count site's a little bit in limbo right now because the main counter who really kept it alive actually passed away, unfortunately, and so I think there's probably going to be some scrambling going on. Which reminds me, I want to talk to Shiawassee Wildlife Refuge to see if they want to do any partnering similar to what the Detroit River Wildlife Group is doing with the Detroit River Hawk Watch. That's what a cool partnership that is. So I need to talk to Jessica Fletcher, who you might meet this weekend, about that.
And that point, Port Austin is the tip of the thumb, right?
Yes, yeah. And it's interesting, a lot of those birds, they'll get good broadwing flights as well. And some of the birds will cross, but a lot of the birds are actually they're following the shoreline. We didn't talk about migration and Michigan tonight. That wasn't the purpose. But these birds aren't crossing big bodies of water. So they'll go around the thumb, they'll just follow that shoreline around Saginaw Bay and then kind of go along their merry way. In most cases, sometimes though, when you've got a really good flight going on with things like broadwings, if you have a cloudless sky, these birds are so high up you can hardly find them with your binoculars. And I mean, they're stratospheric, and when they're that high on good winds, they'll cross over that body of water like Lake Erie, Saginaw Bay with no problem. It's wild. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It was just a pleasure as always. I love your group, and it was really fun. So thank you for having me.
Thanks
Thank
a
you,
lot.
Josh.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. We really appreciate you doing your presentation for us tonight. It was fantastic as always. Maximum number of people on the call was in the 100 and teens, I think.
Sweet.
So was excellent. Thank you so much for bringing everybody into our fold as well as our sharing with your fold.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And everyone keep in mind that Ben Lucking's got a great offering coming up shortly for the trip to Ecuador. He's really we're only charging a very, very reasonable price since Ben's going to be leading most everything for us and only and not taking a fee, just having us pay his expenses. So we're able to give this trip at a really, really reasonable fee. So please come along with us. Josh, you should join us. It'll be a blast.
I wish. Oh man, the joys of two little kids, man. Let me tell
Oh yeah.
you.
Ah,
Oh,
I'm jealous.
there.
Thank you
Yeah,
again.
I was there, and now my kids are in college, so I'm going.
I'm so glad you're going, Juliet. Good for you.
yeah. Juliet, Ben's trip sounds so good that I wish I could cancel my Antarctica trip. To go
Oh,
to
boy.
Ecuador trip.
Twist the dagger, Mike. Thanks.
Oh, I can't wait to see your program on Antarctica, Mike.
There you go.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm gonna stop the recording now. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks so much again, Josh. It was fantastic.